The quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled between rows of neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences, lived Jake Thompson. His home wasn't the fanciest on the block, but it had one thing that made it special: his backyard. It was massive, sprawling, and bursting with life. Towering oak trees shaded patches of wildflowers, while a small vegetable garden thrived in one corner. On weekends, you could always find Jake out there, tending to his plants or tossing a ball for Max, his golden retriever. The backyard was more than just a piece of land. It was Jake's happy place, his escape from the daily grind. The neighborhood itself seemed idyllic at first glance. Houses were painted in cheerful colors. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks, and everyone waved hello as they passed by. But beneath this picture-perfect surface lurked tension, mostly thanks to the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA liked rules, a lot of them. From how high your grass could grow to what color your mailbox had to be, no detail was too small for their scrutiny. Most residents followed these guidelines without complaint, but Jake preferred to keep things low-key. He paid his dues, kept his house tidy, and stayed out of trouble. That is, until Karen entered the scene. Karen was not your average neighbor. She was the kind of person who carried a clipboard wherever she went and spoke in clipped tones during HOA meetings. Her blonde bob haircut and perfectly pressed blazers gave her an air of authority, even though she worked as a part-time yoga instructor. To say Karen took her role seriously would be an understatement. She saw herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's standards, often going above and beyond to enforce every rule, no matter how trivial. If someone hung Christmas lights too early, Karen would march over and remind them of the official start date. If a lawn grew slightly longer than regulation length, expect a strongly worded letter in your mailbox. Jake had crossed paths with Karen before, usually over minor infractions like leaving his trash invisible for an extra day. Each time, he brushed it off, thinking it wasn't worth the hassle. But lately, Karen had been eyeing his backyard with increasing interest. At first, it was subtle, a comment here about how underutilized the space was, or a suggestion there about turning it into something more productive. Jake laughed it off, assuming she was joking. After all, how could anyone consider a thriving garden and a happy dog underutilized? But Karen wasn't joking. Beneath her polite smiles and thinly veiled suggestions lay a growing obsession with Jake's property. She began attending HOA meetings armed with charts and graphs, arguing that large backyards like Jake's were inefficient uses of space. "We're wasting potential," she declared once, tapping her pointer stick against a poster board filled with statistics. Some neighbors nodded along, intrigued by her vision of progress. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they agreed but unwilling to challenge her. Jake, however, rolled his eyes and tuned out, confident that his little slice of paradise was safe. What Jake didn't know was that Karen wasn't just talking about efficiency for fun. She had bigger plans, plans that involved developers, contracts, and a whole lot of money. And soon enough, those plans would come crashing into Jake's peaceful world like a wrecking ball, turning his sanctuary into a battleground. Little did he know, his fight to protect his backyard would become the talk of the entire neighborhood, and maybe even change it forever. One sunny afternoon, Jake returned home from work feeling unusually relaxed. The day had been uneventful, and he was looking forward to unwinding in his backyard with a cold drink. As he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. His gaze drifted toward the backyard, and that's when he noticed it. A group of strangers walking around near his vegetable garden, holding clipboards and measuring tapes. At first, he thought maybe they were utility workers or landscapers hired by mistake. But as he stepped out of his car and approached them, his stomach sank. "Excuse me," Jake called out, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up his spine. "What's going on here?" One of the men turned to him, clipboard in hand. "Oh, hi there. We're surveying the property for the new development project." "Development project," Jake repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What are you talking about? This is my backyard." The man glanced at his papers before responding. According to our records, this portion of the land has been sold to us by the HOA. We've got permits and everything. Jake stood frozen, his mind racing. Sold? How could anyone sell part of his property without his knowledge? He thanked the man curtly and stormed inside, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Grabbing his phone, he scrolled through emails and documents, searching for answers. Nothing made sense. Frustrated, he decided to confront Karen directly. At the next HOA meeting, Jake arrived early, determined to get to the bottom of things. When Karen walked in, clipboard in tow, she barely acknowledged him. But as soon as the meeting began, Jake raised his hand. "Karen," he said firmly, "can you explain why surveyors are in my backyard, saying the HOA sold part of my property to a developer?" Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her blazer and gave him a tight-lipped smile. Yes, Jake. I'm glad you brought that up. You see, we've identified certain areas of underutilized land within the community, including your backyard. It's nothing personal. It's just good business sense." "Good business sense," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. "You sold part of my backyard without even asking me." "It's all outlined in the HOA agreement," Karen replied smoothly, waving a finger in the air like a teacher correcting a student. "There's a clause allowing us to repurpose unused portions of members' properties for the betterment of the neighborhood. And let's be honest, Jake, do you really need that much space? Imagine what we could build here. Luxury condos, maybe even a small park." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. Luxury condos, a park. None of this had anything to do with him or his home. Yet Karen spoke as if she were doing him a favor, as if bulldozing his sanctuary was somehow an act of kindness. His fists clenched under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He needed answers. After the meeting, Jake cornered Karen in the hallway. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll fight this every step of the way." Karen smirked, clearly unfazed. "Suit yourself, Jake. But trust me, you won't win. The paperwork is airtight." As Jake drove home, his mind raced with questions. How had he missed such a ridiculous clause in the HOA agreement? Why hadn't anyone warned him? And most importantly, how could he possibly stop construction from starting? By the time he pulled into his driveway, the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. Bulldozers would soon tear apart the place he loved most. Over the next few days, orange cones appeared in his yard, followed by heavy machinery. Workers began digging trenches, ripping out plants, and flattening the soil where Jake's garden once flourished. Every hammer strike and engine roar felt like a dagger to his heart. Neighbors peeked over their fences, some curious, others sympathetic, but none willing to challenge Karen's authority. Jake felt utterly alone, staring at the destruction of his sanctuary, while the woman responsible sat smugly behind her rules and regulations. It was clear now. This wasn't just about property lines or zoning laws. It was personal. And Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. Jake wasn't the kind of person to sit back and let life steamroll him. But as he watched his once beautiful backyard transform into a construction zone, he felt powerless for the first time in years. The sight of bulldozers tearing up his garden was enough to make his blood boil. But what really stung was how easily Karen had dismissed him. She acted like she was untouchable, hiding behind layers of fine print and bureaucracy. Determined to fight back, Jake hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patul who specialized in property disputes. Their initial meeting didn't go well. Sitting across from her in a cramped office filled with stacks of legal books, Jake listened as she explained the grim reality. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Ms. Patul said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "The HOA's agreement does give them some authority over parts of your property. There's a clause allowing them to repurpose unused land if they deem it beneficial to the community." Her tone softened slightly. "But don't lose hope yet. These cases can take months, sometimes years to resolve. We'll need to dig deeper into the specifics." "Months? Years? Jake's stomach churned at the thought. By then, the condos would already be built, and his backyard would be lost forever. Still, he nodded, clutching onto the faint glimmer of hope Miss Patel offered. He authorized her to file a lawsuit against the HOA, hoping to at least stall the construction while they figured things out. But lawsuits cost money, lots of it, and Jake quickly found himself drowning in legal fees. His savings dwindled, and stress became a constant companion. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how far he could push before he ran out of resources. Meanwhile, the construction crew worked tirelessly, oblivious to the chaos brewing behind the scenes. Foundations were poured, steel beams arrived, and soon the skeleton of a luxury condo complex began to rise where Jake's wildflowers used to bloom. Each day, he woke up to the sound of hammers and drills, a cruel reminder of everything slipping through his fingers. Neighbors whispered among themselves, torn between admiration for Jake's resistance and fear of crossing Karen. Some even avoided eye contact when passing by his house, unwilling to get dragged into the drama. Karen, on the other hand, seemed thrilled with herself. She strutted around the neighborhood like a peacock, boasting about the progress being made. At one point, she stopped by Jake's driveway, clipboard in hand, to deliver what she probably thought was a conciliatory speech. "You know, Jake," she said sweetly, though her eyes gleamed with triumph, "this could have been so much easier if you just cooperated. Think about it. A modern development right here. It'll increase property values for everyone." Jake clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to snap at her. Instead, he forced a tight smile and replied, "Funny, I don't recall anyone asking me if I wanted my home turned into a parking lot for yuppies." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Well, sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good," she said primly before walking away, leaving Jake fuming. As weeks turned into months, the gap between Jake and Karen widened. While Jake scrambled to gather evidence and build his case, Karen doubled down on her efforts to justify the sale. She held impromptu meetings with other neighbors, showing flashy presentations about the economic benefits of the new condos. To her credit, she was persuasive. Some residents started nodding along, seduced by promises of higher property values and shiny amenities. Others remained skeptical, quietly rooting for Jake, but too intimidated to speak up. Despite the mounting pressure, Jake refused to give up. Late at night, after Max had curled up at his feet and the sounds of construction had faded, he scoured old documents, searching for anything that might help his case. He reached out to former owners of his house, hoping they could shed light on the HOA's policies when they purchased the property. He even visited City Hall, poring over zoning maps and permits, desperate for answers. But the clock was ticking. Every day brought the project closer to completion, and Jake knew he was running out of time. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it hard to focus on anything else. Friends noticed the change. He looked tired, distracted, and perpetually stressed. One evening, over pizza, his best friend Mark tried to offer some advice. "Maybe it's time to cut your losses, man," he said gently. "I mean, fighting the HOA is like trying to stop a freight train with your bare hands." Jake shook his head, determination burning in his eyes. "I can't just roll over, Mark. That backyard isn't just dirt and grass. It's part of who I am. If I let them win, what's next? What stops them from taking more?" Jake had always been a reasonable man, someone who believed in solving problems through dialogue and patience. But as the construction on his backyard continued unchecked, something inside him snapped. He couldn't sit idly by while bulldozers erased years of memories. The laughter-filled barbecues, the quiet mornings spent gardening, the countless games of fetch with Max. Every slab of concrete poured felt like another nail in the coffin of his sanctuary. The legal battle was dragging on, and Karen's smug confidence only fueled his frustration. Jake realized that if he wanted to protect what was his, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. Late one night, After hours spent staring at blueprints and zoning laws, inspiration struck. It wasn't exactly legal, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Jake began sketching out a plan. A bold, risky move that would send a clear message to both the developer and Karen. By morning, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The next day, using a friend's name to avoid suspicion, Jake rented a small excavator from a local equipment rental company. He told them it was for clearing brush on a rural property, which wasn't technically a lie. He just omitted the part about whose property it really was. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Jake parked his truck a few blocks away and walked quietly back to his house. The neighborhood was eerily silent, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the hum of distant streetlights. His heart pounded as he climbed into the cab of the excavator, its metal frame towering over him like a mechanical beast ready to strike. With trembling hands, Jake fired up the engine and guided the machine toward the construction site. The half-built foundation loomed ahead, an ugly scar on the landscape he once cherished. Taking a deep breath, he positioned the bucket of the excavator and slammed it down onto the freshly poured concrete. The sound echoed through the night, sharp and jarring, but Jake didn't stop. Again and again, he swung the heavy machinery, smashing through rubber, wood, and debris until nothing remained but a pile of rubble. Dust filled the air, mingling with the faint glow of moonlight as Jake worked tirelessly to undo weeks of progress. By the time he finished, sweat soaked his shirt, and his arms ached from gripping the controls. But looking at the wreckage before him, Jake felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he'd taken back some control. He carefully drove the excavator back to the rental lot, wiped it down to remove any traces of dirt, and returned home just as dawn broke. Exhausted but exhilarated, he collapsed onto his couch, listening for the inevitable fallout. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, the developer arrived at the site, only to find their project reduced to ruins. Chaos erupted almost immediately. Workers shouted, pointing at the destruction, while phones buzzed with frantic calls between contractors and executives. News spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon enough, Karen appeared on Jake's doorstep, her face flushed with rage. "What did you do?" she demanded, jabbing a finger at him. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Jake leaned casually against his doorway, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about, Karen? I've been here all night." "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped. "Who else would do something like this? You're going to regret this, Jake. Mark my words." Despite her threats, Jake held his ground, maintaining a calm demeanor. Inside, though, his mind raced. He knew Karen suspected him, but without proof, there was little she could do. Still, the tension between them crackled like electricity, each word dripping with unspoken accusations. As Karen stormed off to call the police, Jake couldn't help but smile. Sure, he might face consequences later, but for now, he'd dealt a blow to their plans. And more importantly, he'd reminded them that they couldn't walk all over him without resistance. Word of the demolition spread like wildfire among the neighbors. Some were shocked, others amused, and a few secretly cheered Jake on. Whatever the reaction, one thing was certain. Jake Thompson was no longer the quiet, easygoing guy everyone thought they knew. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he wasn't backing down. The morning after Jake's midnight demolition job, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Neighbors gathered in clusters on sidewalks and driveways, whispering about the ruined construction site. Some were shocked by the audacity of the act, while others couldn't help but admire the boldness behind it. The once pristine foundation now lay in ruins, a jagged mess of broken concrete and twisted rebar. It was as if a storm had swept through overnight, leaving chaos in its wake. Karen wasted no time pointing fingers. She marched up and down the street, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, accusing Jake at every turn. "It's obvious who did this," she declared during an impromptu gathering outside the HOA clubhouse. "Jake Thompson thinks he can take the law into his own hands." Well, let me tell you, vandalism won't solve anything. Jake stood nearby, arms crossed, listening silently as Karen ranted. He kept his expression neutral, refusing to rise to her bait. Instead, he simply shrugged when neighbors glanced his way, letting them draw their own conclusions. The lack of evidence worked in his favor. Without proof, all Karen could do was speculate. And speculation wasn't enough to bring charges against him. Still, the fallout from the demolition rippled far beyond Karen's accusations. The developer, furious over the destruction of their project, filed a lawsuit, not against Jake, but against the HOA. They claimed negligence, arguing that the association should have secured the property better. This revelation threw Karen into a tailspin. Suddenly, she wasn't just dealing with one angry homeowner. She was facing legal action from a powerful corporation demanding compensation for their losses. Her confident facade began to crack under the pressure. Tensions within the neighborhood reached a boiling point. At the next HOA meeting, tempers flared as residents argued over whose fault the situation really was. Some sided with Karen, insisting that rules were rules and Jake needed to fall in line. Others defended him, saying the HOA had overstepped its bounds by selling off private property without consent. Voices rose, chairs scraped against the floor, and at one point, two neighbors nearly came to blows over whether progress or preservation mattered more. Amid the chaos, Jake remained eerily calm. He attended the meeting not to argue, but to observe. Watching the community fracture before his eyes gave him mixed feelings. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing he wasn't alone in questioning Karen's authority. On the other hand, seeing neighbors turn against each other saddened him. This wasn't how communities were supposed to work. Yet he couldn't deny that the turmoil exposed cracks in the system he'd long suspected existed. As days passed, the developer's lawsuit dominated local headlines. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, snapping photos of the demolished site and interviewing anyone willing to talk. Some neighbors played coy, unwilling to comment publicly, while others seized the opportunity to air grievances they'd kept bottled up for years. One elderly woman told a reporter, "I've lived here 30 years, and I never agreed to let them sell parts of my land. If they can do it to Jake, what's stopping them from doing it to me?" The media attention only made things worse for Karen, her carefully crafted image as the neighborhood's guardian began to crumble. Photos of her scowling at reporters circulated online, accompanied by captions labeling her the HOA tyrant. Anonymous posts popped up on social media mocking her tactics, and even some longtime supporters started distancing themselves. For the first time, Karen looked vulnerable, her polished exterior chipped away by relentless scrutiny. Meanwhile, Jake became something of a reluctant hero. People stopped him in grocery store aisles to quietly thank him for standing up to the HOA. A few even offered financial support to help cover his mounting legal fees. While Jake appreciated the gestures, he didn't seek glory. All he wanted was justice, and maybe a little peace and quiet in his backyard again. But the battle wasn't over yet. The developer's lawsuit put immense pressure on the HOA, forcing them to dig deeper into their records. And buried within those dusty files was a detail no one had anticipated, a zoning discrepancy that could change everything. As news of this discovery trickled out, Jake allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was finally turning in his favor. The discovery that changed everything came from an unlikely source. Ms. Patel, Jake's lawyer. She had spent weeks poring over decades-old zoning maps and HOA agreements, searching for anything that could strengthen Jake's case. And then, late one evening, she found it. A tiny but critical detail buried in the fine print. The land in question, the very portion of Jake's backyard sold to the developer, wasn't zoned for commercial use. It was classified as residential property, meaning any attempt to build luxury condos there violated local zoning laws. When Jake heard the news, he nearly dropped his phone. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. This whole time, they were breaking the law. Ms. Patel's tone was calm but triumphant. Yes, Jake. The HOA doesn't have the authority to rezone your property without approval from the city council, and they never sought that approval. This invalidates the entire sale. Jake felt a surge of hope for the first time in months. If this information got out, it wouldn't just stop the construction, it would dismantle Karen's entire argument. He immediately shared the revelation with Ms. Patel, who wasted no time filing a motion to present the evidence in court. But Jake didn't wait for the legal process to play out. He knew the power of public opinion. The next day, armed with copies of the zoning documents, Jake called a neighborhood meeting. Dozens of residents showed up, curious about what he had to say. Standing at the front of the room, Jake laid out the facts plainly and clearly. Karen sold part of my backyard to a developer. He began, his voice steady. But here's the thing. She didn't just ignore me or bend the rules. She broke the law. This land isn't zoned for condos. It never has been. A murmur rippled through the crowd as neighbors exchanged stunned glances. Some pulled out their phones to snap pictures of the documents Jake held up for everyone to see. Others whispered angrily about how Karen had misled them all. Even those who'd previously supported her looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen tried to interrupt, her face red with indignation. "This is nonsense," she sputtered. "We followed every regulation." "No, Karen," Jake shot back, his voice firm. "You didn't. You sold off land you had no right to sell. And now, because of your actions, the developer is suing us, the homeowners, for damages we shouldn't even be responsible for." The room erupted into heated discussion. People turned on Karen, demanding answers. How could she not know about the zoning issue? Why hadn't she double-checked before making such a reckless decision? For once, Karen had no response. Her usual confidence crumbled under the weight of mounting accusations. She stammered, trying to defend herself, but her words fell flat. The damage was done. The fallout was swift and brutal. Embarrassed and overwhelmed, Karen resigned from the HOA later that week, citing personal reasons. No one believed her vague explanation, but no one cared enough to press further. Her reign of clipboard-wielding tyranny was officially over. In her absence, the HOA scrambled to clean up the mess she'd left behind. They issued a formal apology to Jake and agreed to cover the legal costs incurred by the developer's lawsuit. More importantly, they revoked the sale of Jake's property, acknowledging that it had never been valid in the first place. For Jake, the victory was bittersweet. Yes, he'd reclaimed his backyard, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Trust within the neighborhood had been shaken, and old friendships strained under the weight of conflict. Still, there was a silver lining. The scandal forced the HOA to reevaluate its policies, leading to more transparency and accountability. Residents began attending meetings again, determined to ensure nothing like this happened in the future. As the dust settled, Jake allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He stood in what remained of his backyard, surveying the wreckage left behind by both the construction crew and his own excavator. Despite the destruction, he could already picture it coming back to life. New plants taking root, fresh soil replacing the rubble, and Max bounding happily across the open space. It wouldn't be easy, but rebuilding was possible. Just like his backyard, the neighborhood could heal too, with time, effort, and a renewed sense of community. With the legal battle finally over and his backyard rightfully restored to him, Jake set out to rebuild, not just the physical space, but also his sense of peace. The first step was clearing away the debris left behind by both the developers and his own late-night demolition spree. It was backbreaking work, hauling chunks of concrete and twisted metal to the curb, but Jake didn't mind. Each load he carried felt like shedding another layer of frustration, another reminder of the chaos that had consumed his life for so long. Neighbors noticed his efforts and began pitching in. Mark showed up one Saturday morning with a wheelbarrow and gloves, ready to help. "Figured you could use an extra pair of hands," he said with a grin. Soon, Others joined in, some bringing tools, others offering snacks and cold drinks. What started as a solitary mission turned into a neighborhood event, laughter and conversation filling the air as people worked side by side. For the first time in months, the atmosphere felt lighter, almost celebratory. As the rubble disappeared, Jake began envisioning what his backyard could become again. He planted new trees, their slender trunks promising shade in years to come. Flower beds sprang up where wildflowers once grew, vibrant bursts of color reclaiming the landscape. In one corner, he built a small gazebo, a nod to moving forward while honoring the past. It became a favorite spot for quiet mornings with coffee or evenings watching the sunset, with Max curled at his feet. The transformation extended beyond Jake's property. The ordeal had sparked something in the neighborhood, a renewed sense of unity and vigilance. Residents started attending HOA meetings more regularly, asking tough questions and holding leaders accountable. New bylaws were introduced to prevent similar situations from happening again, including stricter guidelines on property sales and clearer communication between the HOA and homeowners. Karen's resignation opened the door for fresh leadership, and a younger couple stepped up to take charge. They prioritized collaboration over control, earning praise from even the most skeptical neighbors. Jake found himself smiling more often these days. Neighbors who had once avoided him now stopped by to chat or invite him to barbecues. Kids ran through his yard again, laughing as they chased each other around the newly planted trees. One evening, someone suggested hosting a block party to celebrate the end of the drama. Tables lined the street, laden with homemade dishes and desserts. Music played softly in the background as people mingled, sharing stories and laughter under strings of twinkling lights. During the party, several neighbors approached Jake to thank him, not just for standing up to Karen, but for inspiring them to speak up too. "You showed us we don't have to sit back and let things happen to us," one woman said, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to fighting for what's right." Jake raised his own glass, feeling humbled yet proud. He hadn't set out to be a hero, but in standing up for his home, he'd ignited a change that rippled through the entire community. The scars of the conflict would always remain: shattered relationships, bruised egos, and lingering mistrust, but healing was possible. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood was finding its way back to harmony. As the night wound down and guests began heading home, Jake lingered in his backyard, looking out at the glowing gazebo and the freshly planted garden. Max trotted over, tail wagging, and dropped a tennis ball at his feet. Jake chuckled, picking it up and tossing it across the yard. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. Better than good, it was hopeful. And sometimes, hope was all anyone really needed to start anew.